snapped out of his revelry. Ash shifted the car into drive and put his foot on the gas. He swung the sedan in a large arc to drive back the way he had come. While he had no clue where he was, the panicking man figured if he just drove back the way they had come, he would eventually find a town. After that, he would figure it out. But right now, all that mattered was escaping the bizarre storm. The events he had just survived tumbled through his mind. He wondered if he had really seen what he thought he had. Did the snow truly reduce his captor to a broken, bloody mess? It seemed impossible, but it had happened right in front of him. He had seen his blood spill onto the snow and heard his dying screams. Ashram shuddered. Whether from his cold, drenched clothes or the fresh memories, he didn't know. He basked in the heat of the car like a lizard baking in the sun, soaking up every ounce of the glorious warmth. The snow on his clothes had begun to melt, and with it they brought a fresh, soggy hell. Shivers took full control of his body, and he just shook in the driver's seat. Frozen hands gripped the steering wheel as if they were chunks of stone. He fought desperately to make sure his body's trembling didn't pull the wheel. With a quick glance into the rearview mirror, his breath was sucked out of his lungs. In the distance behind him, he saw the encroaching storm. Blistering white turmoil had swallowed the road behind him. Worse still, it was marching forward at an alarming rate. Ash had been driving cautiously as to not slip into one of the drifts by the side of the road, but if he kept going at the same speed, the storm would quickly overtake him. Fearfully, he pressed harder on the gas. The engine bellowed a fiery growl, and the car shot forward. For the first time since his ordeal started, Ash spared a glance at the clock. He was shocked to discover it was well past midnight. Given the impenetrable night around him, the time made sense, but he was in awe over how long he had been in the back seat. The high beams clicked on and gave him a few more feet of visible road, but even still, with no street lamps, he could hardly see where he was going. But he dared not slow down. The storm was still coming. As he looked back, it seemed like it was moving even faster. It was like a predator who had caught the scent of blood. A yellow sign warned him that a sharp turn was coming up. Out of fear of simply wrecking the car, he slowed down enough to take the steep bend in the road. However, this gave the blizzard enough time to catch up. When he started to accelerate again, the snow was at his heels. Then in the next moment, a shroud of white had surged past him. Instantly, he was inside the confines of the storm. A curtain of sheer falling snow enveloped the sedan and Ash inside. He cried out as the blizzard overtook him. Where it had been difficult to see in the pitch of night, the blistering snow was simply impenetrable. Fear swallowed him. The memory of his captor collapsing to the ground in a bloody heap was still fresh in his mind. He wondered if the snow could eat its way inside of the car, cracking it open like a nut and claiming the sweet prize within. But as he continued to drive, if it could break in, it didn't. That didn't stop Ash from worrying about the possibility. Hunching over the steering wheel, he watched the road as if it might disappear out from under him. Hunching over the steering wheel, he watched the road as if it might disappear out from under him. Ash slowly made his way through the unnatural storm. Now that he was inside the icy maw, he could hardly see a foot in front of the car. Even with the high beams on, only succeeded in turning the snow a frosty shade of blue. This was how he crawled along the country road, searching for any trace of humanity in the tundra that had enveloped him. At any given moment, he could see only about a foot ahead of him. The traffic signs had been completely swallowed in the swirling screen that raged around him. He drove like this for what felt like an eternity, but the clock told him it had only been 20 minutes. His palms were beginning to sweat from both his nerves and the heat blasting out of the vents by his knuckles. Daring to only take one hand off the wheel at a time, he quickly wiped them on his damp pants. Grimacing, he shrugged and resigned himself to clammy palms. It was then that an idea cut through him like lightning. The radio. He quickly switched it on to see if it had anything to say about the storm, or at least play some saccharine hits to take his mind off his grim predicament. At first, he could only hear static, with a hint of classical music underlining the crackling fuzz. After hitting up the tuner repeatedly, he finally caught a station that came in clearly enough to understand. Residents of the area are advised to A indoors. Do not open any windows or your doors. Bring in pets. The county is advising to not go outside until they stand the storm more fully. I repeat, do not. The words were replaced by a sharp, scratching screech before a soft hissing overtook it once more. Ash chewed on his bottom lip as he waited for the words to come back, but they never did. He wasn't sure if he found it comforting or horrifying that whatever was happening wasn't just happening to him. Eventually, he settled on neutral negative. He wasn't sure when it happened, but at some point the white wall of snow around him lessened, as if it had moved on to new, easier-to-catch prey. Shortly after this, he started to see a yellow light swirling in the distance. A tendril of potential began to wind through him. Perhaps he wasn't the only one stuck out here. There might be help in this wasteland after all. But as he drew closer, the wavering flame of hope was snuffed out. Ash came upon two vehicles by the side of the road. The first one was a mammoth tow truck. The yellow light on top of the cab was still flashing a warning to all those who came near. The driver's side door was wide open. Snow and frost had already carpeted the interior of the truck. Then his eyes caught a red sports car crashed on the drift by the side of the road. The front was hidden underneath an imposing heap of snow. Despite the vehicles, he saw no trace of the people that might have driven them. It was then he saw a wool coat flop across the road. It was difficult to make out much, but there appeared to be big pools of a dark substance on the coat. He wasn't sure if it was his eyes playing tricks on him, but it looked like there was a skeletal hand still caught in one of the black sleeves. Ash blanched and pressed his foot to the gas. He grimaced as he heard a loud crunch from underneath his wheel. His jaw clenched as he tried to not dwell on the stomach-churning noise, and soon the ghastly scene was in his rearview mirror. As he drove, the picture of the skeletal hand refused to leave his mind. He had a sinking suspicion he knew what became of John. The fiend would be just one more set of bones out in the wastes. Ash wanted to take some sort of satisfaction in this realization. Whatever victory that knowledge held seemed Pyrrhic. Ash eyed the gas meter. He had been driving for over 30 minutes at this point. He still had over half a tank left. With each slow tick down, it felt like the hangman coming one more step up the gallows. If he didn't find help soon, he knew he would be stranded out here. Then it would only be a matter of deciding which way he would rather die. The cold or the storm. Either way, it was not an enticing proposition. He had been out for hours. The maniac could have driven him hundreds of miles in that time. It was clear to him that his captor had been a practiced hand at the abduction game. But for the malevolent grace of the storm that thrashed around him now, he would certainly be on ice. As grateful as he was for that stroke of luck, he wasn't interested in dying out here due to nature's wrath either. Accordingly, he drove blindly in the opaque screen of winter. Occasionally, he would flip through the radio channels for some strand of information or direction. Nothing aside from the sibilant whispers of the airwaves ever spoke back. He wondered how many stranded cars were out there with him, off to the side, unseen in the pearly haze, devoured by an endless appetite of the squall. The car's fuel continued to dwindle, and with it his dream of salvation. He thought of his family, his parents, whom he had never had the nerve to tell the truth to. People who had loved him, but under the condition that he fit the pre-cut notions of what he ought to be. Filled with expectations he could never live up to. Then his mind drifted to his sister, the only person in the world that had ever understood him. The faces of friends and lovers swirled in his mind like the sheets of snow outside. Finally, his mind landed on the handsome face of the grim man that had doomed Ash to never see any of these people again. He was only broken from his thoughts when the light from a street lamp managed to bleed through the storm and onto his windshield. As he continued to drive, another burst of light hit him, and then another, his heart filled with joy at the prospect of civilization and the cozy comforts it would surely have. The thought of hot coffee and its euphoric aroma brewed within him. He slowed the car even further when he saw the faintest shadow of a sign through the vortex of snow. Bear Creek, population 5,000. That was all it said. It was a tiny town, and one he had never heard of. But the thought of people, anyone at all, caused his soggy hairs to bristle with excitement. It wasn't long after he saw this sign that he began to see the silhouettes of houses. He had half a mind to just pull into the driveway of the first one he passed. But as he drew closer, it occurred to him that something was wrong. None of them had their lights on. They were all dark, shadowy things, standing silent and black, like mausoleums in a graveyard. His optimism wavered, but he wasn't about to give up. He told himself that they had probably just lost power in the storm. It didn't mean that the town was as lifeless as the lonely highway he had been on, or the frozen woods where he had nearly died. But then he noticed that it was not just the houses that had gone dark, but the street lamps above him as well now, as if the loss of the lights heralded the end of the town itself. However, he continued to drive. Before long, he crept into what must have been the main street of the tiny town. He scanned the sidewalks beside him and the shadowy brick exteriors for any hints of life. At first, he saw nothing. It felt as if the entire place had been abandoned. But then he caught the sight of a red scarf blowing in the wind like a flag. It had gotten tied up around one of the silent street lamps and flapped violently in the wind. His eyes traced down the pole, only to be rewarded with a winter jacket half buried in the snow. As his eyes adjusted, he saw the outline of a pair of jeans and boots. Ash ground his teeth and tightened his sweaty hands on the steering wheel. The frozen clothes were still stained with dark red, as if the blood had frozen before it even had a chance to properly dry. Much of the corpse was buried in the soft white mounds, but he knew if he could see under it, there would be a skeleton. One that was picked clean and was a gleaming white, almost the same shade as the snow itself. He was so grateful he couldn't see it. The broiling storm shifted, and he could see the facade of what appeared to have been a pharmacy. The large pane of glass that lined the exterior had smashed in. It reminded Ash of a face that's teeth had been knocked in. The interior remained shadowy and unknowable. All he could make out was that inside had a thick layer of snow covering everything. All of the aisles and the spinning rack of holiday cards had been completely covered in the tiny white crystals. It was like the snow was an aggressive fungus covering all that it could touch. As he scanned the store, he saw the gleam of a brown dress shoe. Then he caught another poking out of the snow. He tried to follow them up, but the slacks they accompanied disappeared into the darkness. He doubted he wanted to see what lay at the end of them anyway. Pushing his foot to the gas gently, the car left the snowy tombs behind. It was hard for him to imagine what could have shattered that glass. Was the wind truly that strong? Perhaps some solid debris had been caught in the storm and rammed into the window. But even that seemed hard to imagine. He tried to put it out of his mind as he scanned for survivors. Before him, he caught sight of what looked to be a tiny playground. He guessed that it was the front of an elementary school, but the swirling sheets of white made it impossible to say. What he could see were pieces of equipment meant to foster childhood joy, but now they were slick with ice. Long icicles hung off of them like slippery fangs. There was a half-built snowman between the monkey bars and the swings. It had no head, only a rounded base and middle. It was then he noticed several large lumps in the snow buried next to the snowman. Ash grimaced and tried to swallow in a dry mouth. He was no longer curious, and he was certain he didn't need to know what was under those piles. With a trembling foot, he once more pushed the gas pedal down. Hope was beginning to drain from him completely. His spirits lifted when he could make out spinning red and blue lights in the distance. Perhaps the cavalry had arrived, and the police were starting to take back the town. He wasn't completely sure what exactly they were taking the town back from, but still, it was exciting. Ash craved a return to order from this lawless, frozen world he found himself in. As he inched closer in the rising snow, he could see that much of the street beyond still had power. His pulse was beating in his throat now. This was it. He was finally going to be saved. In his elation, he failed to notice the fulcrum of the storm ahead. A giant, gyrating planet of snow that pulsed with life and hunger, and sat above the town, surveying all in its new domain. Searching for prey, it sensed fresh movement with its millions of searching flakes. All hands of the greater being, it began to descend once more. Ash first began to think that misfortune had centered itself onto him when he saw a gleaming badge in the snow. Then he saw another and another, all of them connected to skeletons contorted in agony. Their uniforms were bloody and crisp with frost. Despite the cruiser's light still flaring, now that he was closer, he could see that most of the vehicles had smashed in windows. Their interiors covered with the same layer of snow the pharmacy had been. A section of the town did still have power, though. He began searching through the windows to see if anybody had managed to take refuge. That was when he spotted a well-lit store, shining like a beacon in the night. He drove toward it, hearing the same loud cracking sound from before under his tires as he drove. The harrowing noise made him shiver, but he tried to put it out of his mind. As Ash drove closer, he was elated by the sight of movement. It was still shadowy in the raging torrents of white, but there was definitely motion behind the glass. When he drew nearer, the neon sign above burned the words Dale's Grocery and Deli with defiant neon pink and blue hues. There was something about just seeing electricity still flowing that now seemed wonderfully hopeful. Society and its niceties hadn't been swallowed completely by the malignant frost. But when the store came more into focus, it became apparent that all was not well within. The people inside were frantic, a small group of roughly a dozen by Ash's quick count. The storm seemed to be angrily churning near the store with a new ferocity, like it knew prey was inside of the glass and concrete nut before it, and all that was left was to crack it open and slurp out the soft innards. The frenzied townsfolk inside appeared defenseless as well. Perhaps they had seen the storm smash the police, or heard the quickly silent screams of agony, but regardless, they sensed doom at hand. Their answer was to attempt to barricade the glass with as many of the stackable items as they could. They piled bags of fertilizer and dog food like they were filled with sand. In a last desperate attempt to ward off the otherworldly assault, the longer Ash gazed inside, he felt whatever beacon of hope the grocer had represented erode into darkness. He had simply come upon a candle about to be blown out by a hurricane. The terror-stricken faces of those inside told him all he would ever need to know about the situation at hand. Winds pregnant with snow and ice raged against the helpless building. The ferocity of the storm shaking the glass in its casing. Frozen currents moved unnaturally with purpose, intelligence, and a predatory mind as sharp as broken steel. All of this malice was held together by a bitter and blistering hunger. After a few unsuccessful charges at the store, the wintry assault ebbed, the wind circling back to the street. It was then Ash made eye contact with a young woman. She was holding what he guessed was a wailing infant in her arms, clutching the bundle of jackets and scarves to her as tightly as she could. Ash wanted to signal to her, for her to run to his car before it was too late, but the cancerous feeling that it already was far too late to help grew within him. Still, he wanted to do what he could. It was then he saw a burly man in flannels and a large beard standing beside her, pointing outside. Ash followed the line of his finger into the street. There he witnessed with horror what had surely taken the rest of the town. It was a giant swirling column of ice and snow, a blizzard and a hurricane melding together to become one awful avatar of destruction. Seeing the raw power of this unnatural disaster, doom felt inevitable. The storm lurched forward. The power lines that ran in front of the store were the first things to be devoured. The mighty column swirled the heavy cords like they were strands of spaghetti, ripping them from their wooden and metal moorings and bringing the poles crashing down in the process. The lights died. Ash could now hear the screams from within the store. They managed to pierce the keen of the howling winds, and it made his own heart lament. The towering icy cyclone continued forward in its path of devastation. Wasting no time, it crashed into the front of the store. The glass shattered as if it was pummeled with force it had never known. The bricks and cement began to shake and tremble at the power. The screams of fright transformed into wails of pained agony. It was then Ash caught the grocery door swing open. It was the woman and her child. He smiled and frantically motioned for her to run toward him. She caught the signal and without another word began to dash forward. Ash clenched his fist around the steering wheel, holding his breath in anticipation. He nearly bit his tongue when the woman slipped on a fresh coat of powdery snow. The mother twisted awkwardly as she fell and landed hard on her shoulder, but she had succeeded in shielding her baby from the impact of the asphalt. Even with its mother's sacrifice, the child began to wail. Despite the cold, Ash began to sweat. He wanted to throw the door open and leap out to their rescue, but fear glued him to his seat. He knew the baby's bawling would draw the storm. He was absolutely certain of it. When it did, whether he was out there to help or not. Flesh would be stripped from the bone in moments, and he knew the only difference would be if it was his skin too. Instead, he silently prayed that the woman got up, mouthing soundless words of encouragement. She began to stir. The force on her shoulder had been immense, but she was still alive, still conscious. A groan escaped her lips as she tried to right herself like a capsized ship. On instinct, she whispered sweet words to her baby, its cries penetrating deep into her foggy mind. She was in the middle of telling her child it would be all right when she saw it. The massive snow funnel, with a mind of its own, was cascading its ethereal body toward her. She gasped as reality came crashing down upon her with meteoric fury. Ash had seen it too. The malevolent storm had begun winding its wrath toward them. Terror told him to shift the car in the drive and slam his foot on the gas, but his heart stayed his horrified mind. He knew that if he left them to die when they were so close, he would never know peace again, no matter how short the rest of his life was. It was at that moment, as he stared at the woman's plight, that a furious pounding erupted from the driver's side window. Ash jumped in his seat and swiveled his head to see the intruder. "Get out of the fucking car!" a desperate but stern voice commanded. It took Ash a second to realize that he was now staring at a police officer, but it was the gun leveled at his head that took his breath away. "Get out, now!" he shouted, fear lacing his words, but Ash didn't move a muscle. He was petrified into inaction. His pulse and heart raced as the man continued to pound savagely on the window with his hand. He tried the locked door, but only grunted in rage as it failed to open. Out of terror and worry, Ash snapped a glance at the woman and her child. She was struggling to her feet as the storm's fury bared down on them. Ash could see she wasn't going to make it without help. He was forced to shift his attention back to the window when an explosion of sound and a crack of glass stole his senses. The police officer had begun slamming the butt of his gun into the window. Ash could see the frenzy in the man's eyes. He thought bitterly that if the man would just help the woman into the car, they could all escape. But it was clear the officer had no intention of saving anyone beyond himself, would doom them all to do it. As the officer wound up his arm for another smash, Ash unlocked the door. Then, before the wild policeman could respond, Ash flung the door open, catching the officer off guard. The door pounded into his frostbitten front. The wind was knocked out of the cop and his balance went with his breath. He slipped on the treacherous frost underfoot and he went into a brief free fall. It ended quickly when the back of his head bounced off the icy pavement. Ash wasted no time. Adrenaline and fear pumped through him. He was not thinking, only acting as fast as he could. Ash stepped over the downed officer, keeping his hand pressed against the snowy car for balance. Once he was on the passenger side, he slid as much as walked over to the woman, trying to regain her footing. He grabbed her arm in an attempt to steady her. She looked up at him in shock, but gladly accepted the help on offer. He pulled her up, valiantly trying to keep his balance so that they didn't both fall to their dooms. Once she was on her feet, they took small but fresh steps back to the car. They were able to slam their doors shut right as the howling winds were on top of them. Ash punched the car in the drive and hit the gas pedal. The car's wheels spun before hauling forward into the darkness before them. As they drove away, the only soundtrack they had was the bellows of the wind and the screams of the policemen. Thank you for joining me for part 2 of The Snow is Hungry, written and narrated by me, Remy Militello. Please join me next week for our thrilling conclusion and part 3 and finale of The Snow is Hungry. Stay safe, stay spooky, stay horrifying, all those things. Like and subscribe and leave a comment. Thank you so much.